What would you do if the person you were about to invest billions in looked you in the eye and told you they don't shake hands with people like you? This is the story of a woman who walked into a boardroom as a stranger and walked out holding the power to destroy or transform an entire empire. And what happened next would shake an industry to its core. A California morning looks perfect from a distance, blue skies framed by San Francisco's glass and steel skyline, sunlight glinting off corporate buildings, as if nothing ugly could possibly exist inside them. But Naomi Carter had been in enough boardrooms to know that rot doesn't always show on the surface. She stepped out of a modest black sedan at the curb, her tailored navy dress and simple leather tote projecting quiet competence.
Mr. Whitmore,
without
these numbers
the
from the third
ostentation
quarter
of
are
someone
concerning.
worth billions.
We need to discuss the discrepancies
That was
I've
deliberate.
found.
The less
Mr.
they saw
Whitmore,
coming,
these
the more
numbers
they
from the third
revealed.
quarter are concerning.
Inside,
We need
the
to
air
discuss the
smelled faintly of
discrepancies I've found.
expensive coffee and calculated control. The marble-floored lobby of Apex Systems buzzed with the kind of energy that said everyone knew exactly where they stood in the hierarchy and exactly where they wanted to climb. The receptionist, a young woman with hair twisted into a perfect corporate bun, looked up with a polished smile that faltered the instant her eyes landed on Naomi. It was subtle, but Naomi had spent her life cataloging the tiny hesitations of people recalibrating their expectations. "I'm here for my 10 o'clock with Bradley Whitmore," Naomi said evenly. The woman's brows lifted. "Are you with the administrative applicants, HRs on the third floor?" Naomi didn't blink. "I have an appointment with Mr. Whitmore directly, Naomi Carter." The receptionist's fingers moved over the keyboard eyes, flicking between the monitor and Naomi's face. "Right. Please wait in that area." She gestured toward a line of stiff-backed chairs along a side wall, nowhere near the plush leather lounge, where two white men in tailored suits were being served espresso in porcelain cups. Naomi crossed the lobby without a word, the click of her heels crisp against the marble. She took a seat where she could see everything, the receptionist leaning forward with a warmer smile for the next guest, the elevator doors opening to release a group of laughing executives, all white, all male, passing by without so much as a glance in her direction. The clock ticked. 10 minutes became 20, became 45. Naomi wasn't impatient. She was taking inventory. The distribution of power was visible in every gesture here. The hushed tone when someone glanced her way, the sidelong looks that carried unspoken judgments. She recognized it because it was familiar. She'd been reading this language her entire career. When a tall man in an ill-fitting suit finally appeared and called her name, she followed him down a side hallway. Not to the sunlit boardroom she'd seen in the company's annual report, but to a small windowless meeting room with a wobbling chair and a pitcher of water already sweating onto the laminate table. Whitmore wasn't there yet. Naomi sat her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes on the closed door. The walls here were close, but she didn't feel cornered. She felt ready. Because she knew something they didn't, in less than an hour, this room would give her exactly what she came for. She'd been underestimated before, mistaken for an assistant, an intern, anything but the founder and CEO of Carter Equity Group, a firm with $55 billion in assets and a record of forcing Fortune 500 companies to confront the ugliness in their own cultures. That was why she'd come in the modest sedan, why she wore understated jewelry and carried a plain leather tote instead of the sleek briefcase the press loved to photograph. This was the final stage of an assessment 6 months in the making, and she needed the truth. The unfiltered kind. The door opened. Bradley Whitmore stepped in, phone in hand, eyes still on the screen as if she were invisible. He gestured vaguely toward the chair across from him without looking up. 3 other executives trailed in each one, white male and wearing the same shade of corporate gray. One of them suppressed a smirk when their eyes met hers, the kind that said, "We already know exactly who you are, and you don't matter." They were wrong. Outside, the glass facade of Apex Systems caught the sunlight like a beacon. Inside, Naomi Carter sat quietly in a dim, cramped room, watching the pieces of a much bigger game slide into place. And somewhere just out of sight, her team waited ready to act the moment she gave the word. By the time she walked out of this building, it wouldn't be just another meeting. It would be the beginning of a reckoning. And Bradley Whitmore had no idea it was already too late. The meeting began in a tone so carefully veiled in courtesy that it almost felt rehearsed. Bradley Whitmore finally placed his phone face down on the table and glanced at Naomi Carter as though sizing up an entry-level applicant rather than a potential investor with the power to alter the company's trajectory. His words were smooth, but his eyes carried the weight of an assumption that she was here to be convinced of Apex Systems' greatness, not to scrutinize it. "I suppose you've heard we're leading the market in AI integration." He began clicking through a presentation filled with bright infographics and buzzwords stripped of any real substance. The slides felt designed for someone who might nod politely at the mention of algorithms without ever asking how they actually worked. It was a mistake he would regret. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, but with the precision of a scalpel. "Your prospectus mentions a proprietary neural architecture. Could you elaborate on how it reduces inference latency without sacrificing accuracy at scale?" The pause was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a flicker of surprise, then the faintest tightening around Whitmore's jaw. "Well, that's a very technical question," he said, glancing toward the man on his right, perhaps hoping for rescue. The other executives shifted in their seats, exchanging quick, almost imperceptible smirks. From her position, Naomi could see every silent cue, the way one man's fingers tapped the table in restless amusement, the quick sideways glance another gave before suppressing a laugh. None of this was unfamiliar. The rhythm of quiet disrespect had a tempo she'd heard her entire career, the slow drip of diminished expectations, the presumption that she had stumbled into this room rather than earned her place in it. Whitmore cleared his throat, clicking past the financial slide too quickly. "I think our CTO could walk you through the finer points later. For now, perhaps we could focus on our diversity initiatives. It's a topic we're very proud of." His voice carried an edge of patronizing benevolence, the kind that sounded less like inclusion and more like a public relations exercise. Naomi didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Before we move on," she said finally, "there's a discrepancy in your Q2 filings. R&D spending is down 20%, despite claims of expanded development. I'd like to understand that before we talk about anything else." There it was again, the shift in the air. The man on Whitmore's left leaned back with an amused smile, as though waiting for her to trip over her own audacity. Whitmore himself kept his voice neutral, but his hand tightened on the remote. Those figures are complicated and perhaps not relevant to our discussion today. Naomi registered the dismissal as data. Every choice in this room was evidence not just of Apex's priorities, but of its unspoken hierarchies. She didn't need to provoke them. They were revealing themselves with every word. A young assistant entered with coffee. Whitmore's tone turned almost playful. "How do you take yours, Naomi?" "Let me guess, lots of cream and sugar." The remark was framed as harmless, but the weight of its stereotype landed with the force of a brick. Around the table, some executives chuckled. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Naomi took the cup without comment, her fingers steady. "Black," she said. "Like the record of retention among your minority hires." The laughter stopped. Whitmore blinked, thrown off balance for the first time. "Excuse me, I reviewed your diversity reports," Naomi said evenly. "You've increased minority hires by 9% in 3 years. But there's no documentation of promotion rates or retention. So tell me how many of those hires are still here? How many have moved beyond entry-level roles?" One of the executives shifted uncomfortably. Another stared down at the table. Whitmore attempted a chuckle. "Rome wasn't built in a day." "And empires have fallen in one," Naomi replied. Her voice didn't rise, but the weight of it filled the room. What struck her wasn't the hostility she could confront head-on, but the quiet complicity. The glances passed between men who knew better, but said nothing. The ease with which they accepted the narrative Whitmore fed them. The absence of any challenge to the subtle ways he diminished her presence. Naomi had walked into many rooms like this one. She knew the choreography, the over-explaining, the selective listening, the polite laughter at coded insults, and always the underlying assumption that someone like her black female self-made was there on sufferance not because she commanded the leverage to decide whether a company survived the next fiscal year. What Apex didn't know was that she wasn't here for the tour, or the charm offensive, or the canned statistics meant to soothe public conscience. She was here to watch them, to see whether the rot went deep enough to warrant the outcome she was already prepared to deliver. The signs were everywhere. The momentary dismissal in the receptionist's eyes, the relegation to a cramped side room, the impatient smirks when she spoke in technical terms, the way her questions were brushed aside until they could be handled later. She had enough to know what kind of culture lived beneath the polished glass of Apex's headquarters, and she hadn't even touched her coffee. But she stayed, because she knew they would give her more, and because every minute she remained in that chair, they underestimated her further. That was the part she'd learned to weaponize their certainty that she was here to be convinced, when in reality she was already deciding their fate. Whitmore moved on to the next slide, a glossy image of a multicultural team smiling in a bright, open-plan office. "We value diversity," he said, with the kind of sincerity that belonged on a brochure. "It's a cornerstone of our corporate philosophy." Naomi let the words hang in the air before she asked, "And yet, here we are 10 people in this meeting, and I'm the only one who isn't white, the only one who isn't male. Why do you think that is, Mr. Whitmore?" This time, the silence was heavier. And Naomi knew the undercurrents weren't subtle at all. They were just unacknowledged. And by the time she left, that would no longer be possible. Naomi Carter had sat through enough of Bradley Whitmore's performance to know exactly where this was headed. The glossy promises, the sidelong glances, the half-masked smirks, they were the prelude to something she'd seen too many times before. But she didn't expect the moment to arrive so brazenly. It came as the door opened mid-discussion, and another man entered, tall, white, in an impeccable suit. Whitmore lit up like a man seeing an old friend, rising immediately to greet him with a warm handshake and backslap. "Alan, great to see you," he said, genuine warmth flooding his voice. Then turning back to Naomi, his expression cooled. "I don't shake hands with staff," he added matter-of-factly, as if the words were an accepted truth. For a fraction of a second the room froze. A few executives looked away. Others let faint smirks curl at the corners of their mouths. It wasn't shock they'd seen this before. It was complicity. Naomi didn't flinch. Her expression remained composed. But behind her, still gaze, was a calculation already in motion. She reached for her phone without breaking eye contact and sent a single-word message to her team, waiting 2 blocks away. "Execute." "Excuse me," she said politely, standing. "I'll be right back." Whitmore barely acknowledged her, already leaning toward Alan to resume a conversation that didn't include her. She walked to the restroom, each step steady, deliberate. In the mirror, she studied her reflection, not to repair her composure, but to center it. She'd learned long ago that moments like this weren't personal wounds. They were evidence. And evidence had value. She dialed her CFO, Marcus Lang. "Phase 1, she said simply. "Signal key analysts. Nothing overt, just enough to stir questions." Marcus understood instantly. Within minutes, subtle concerns about Apex's leadership credibility would begin circulating through the market's most influential corners. Back in the conference room, Whitmore's confidence faltered as his phone buzzed twice in quick succession. Naomi returned to find executives glancing at stock tickers, their voices hushed. Apex's value had dipped 1.4% in under 15 minutes. "Something wrong?" she asked lightly. "Just normal market fluctuation," Whitmore said, though his tone had lost its earlier buoyancy. "Nothing you need to worry about, I see," Naomi replied, settling back into her chair. "Then perhaps we can finish our discussion privately." Whitmore led her into his office, a shrine to his career photos, with political leaders' awards from industry associations, a panoramic view of the city skyline. Not a single image showed a person of color in a leadership role. Naomi closed the door behind her. "Let me summarize my experience here today." She began, her voice measured but unyielding. "I was kept waiting for 45 minutes, seated apart from your other guests, spoken to, as though I couldn't understand my own field, interrupted, repeatedly referred to only by my first name, treated as a token rather than an investor, and finally refused a handshake with the explanation that you don't shake hands with staff." Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. "I think you may have misunderstood." Naomi cut him off, her tone still calm. "I recorded our entire interaction. Legally, Georgia is a one-party consent state." She let the words sink in. His phone buzzed again, this time with an urgent call from Apex's board chair. He ignored it, but the flicker of anxiety in his eyes betrayed him. While he tried to craft a response, Naomi continued. "You've built a culture that mirrors exactly what I came here to assess. And now the market is already reacting. Whitmore finally answered his phone, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Naomi caught fragment stock slide, no news released investors concerned. When he hung up, he looked at her with something he hadn't shown before: fear. A few keystrokes on his computer told him why. The search results for Naomi Carter made his stomach drop. Founder and CEO of Carter Equity Partners, managing over $55 billion in assets, known for strategic withdrawals from companies with toxic cultures. Her influence was enough to topple valuations without ever issuing a public statement. Whitmore's posture shifted instantly. Ms. Carter. He began, voice thick with forced contrition. I believe we've gotten off on the wrong foot. If I had known, Naomi stood, her expression unreadable. You knew exactly who you thought I was. That was enough for you to decide how I should be treated. He moved to block her path. We can work this out. I'm sure we can reach an arrangement. An arrangement. Her voice was still calm, but the steel in it made him hesitate. You don't have the leverage to negotiate with me, Mr. Whitmore. Outside the office, employees had begun to gather, drawn by the rising tension. Phones were discreetly raised, recording. Whitmore's eyes darted between Naomi and the watching faces. You can't just walk away. He tried again. I can, she said simply, stepping past him. And I am. By the time she reached the lobby, Apex's stock had dropped nearly 5%. Market analysts were already speculating about leadership issues. Social media buzzed with unconfirmed reports of a high-profile investor walking out of an Apex meeting. In her car, Naomi reviewed the real-time analytics her team had compiled. Market signals triggered exactly as planned, stock volatility growing without any need for public explanation. This isn't about destroying a company, she told Marcus. It's about making the cost of discrimination impossible to ignore. As Apex's headquarters receded in the rearview mirror, Naomi knew the balance of power had shifted. She had entered their building as an assumed outsider. Now, without raising her voice or breaking her composure, she had made them feel the first tremors of a reckoning they could no longer control. The morning after Naomi Carter walked out of Apex's headquarters, the financial world was already in motion. News desks buzzed, markets shifted, and Apex's leadership team woke to a reality they hadn't prepared for. The 5% drop in stock price overnight had deepened to 9% before the opening bell, and industry chatter hinted at a possible withdrawal from one of the sector's most respected investment firms. There was no official confirmation from Carter Equity Partners, but the timing and the speed of the decline spoke louder than any press release could. At Apex's glass-walled boardroom overlooking downtown Seattle, Bradley Whitmore sat flanked by his legal counsel, PR advisors, and the remaining members of his executive team. The atmosphere was thick with unease. Screens lining the wall streamed live market updates, the red downward arrows cutting across Apex's ticker like open wounds. Whitmore's voice was taut with frustration. We need to stop this before it spirals. I want to know who leaked anything to the press. His communications director shook her head. There's nothing to leak, Bradley. No one has said a word. That's the problem. Whatever is happening, it's coming from somewhere we can't trace. And yet, the market knew. Analysts whispered of unaddressed cultural risks and leadership credibility concerns. Social media sleuths dug through LinkedIn profiles and corporate photos noting the glaring absence of diversity at Apex's highest levels. Former employees began dropping cryptic comments online, half-stories that hinted at bias exclusion and a company culture where only certain kinds of people thrived. Meanwhile, across the country in New York, Naomi sat with her senior team in the Carter Equity boardroom. The windows looked out over the skyline, but inside, the focus was sharp. Marcus Lang projected a dashboard of Apex's market performance. "The signals are holding," he reported. "The drop isn't from panic, it's from doubt. Investors aren't sure they can trust Apex's leadership anymore." Naomi studied the data, her fingers steepled in front of her. "Good. This isn't about a single headline. It's about showing that arrogance and exclusion have a measurable cost." She turned to her head of strategy. "Line up the other coalition partners. If Apex tries to spin this as a misunderstanding, we'll release the documentation." Her team understood the stakes. This wasn't a revenge play. It was a market correction in the purest sense, assigning value where value had been ignored in ethical leadership, inclusive cultures, and the kind of workplaces that didn't mistake potential partners for disposable staff. By the end of the week, the ripples had reached beyond Apex. CEOs of other tech firms called emergency meetings with their HR and diversity officers. "Find out where we stand," they ordered. "I don't want to be the next headline." Venture capital firms began reviewing their portfolios for companies that might invite the same kind of scrutiny. At industry conferences, panels on inclusive innovation suddenly sold out. Inside Apex, the pressure became unbearable. Shareholders demanded explanations. The board convened without Whitmore, present a move that in corporate language meant they were already considering leadership changes. PR scrambled to draft a statement, emphasizing commitment to diversity. But without concrete changes, the words landed flat. The moment that shifted the internal tide came from an unexpected voice. During a tense board meeting, Thomas Alvarez, a usually reserved director, spoke up. "My niece graduated top of her engineering class at Stanford," he said quietly. "She worked for a company just like ours. Her ideas were dismissed until repeated by men. She left the industry entirely. We're not just talking about bad optics here. We're talking about losing talent that could make us better." The room fell silent. For the first time, some of the directors saw the situation not just as a PR crisis, but as a structural flaw, undermining the very foundation of their business. Across the country, Naomi tracked these developments with measured interest. She didn't push. She didn't need to. The market and Apex's own people were doing the work for her. She spent her days meeting with coalition partners, strengthening agreements to tie future investments to verifiable cultural health metrics. The story was no longer just about one company. It was becoming a case study for an industry long comfortable with surface-level change. Former Apex employees began contacting Carter Equity. Some wanted to share their stories. Others asked how they could help push for change from the inside. One, a senior engineer named Daniel Wong, sent Naomi a message that stuck with her. "We've been waiting for someone to make it matter to the people in power. You just did." Whitmore, meanwhile, clung to his position with mounting desperation. He held closed-door meetings with his most loyal allies, trying to frame himself as the victim of agenda-driven investors. But outside those rooms, the narrative was slipping beyond his control. Bloomberg ran a piece titled "The Cost of Culture Apex's Leadership Crisis," and CNBC analysts openly questioned whether the company could survive without a leadership overhaul. By the second week, the board made their move. Whitmore was placed on administrative leave pending review, a polite way of removing him while preserving the company's image. Interim leadership fell to a woman who had quietly opposed him for years, COO Patricia Vega. Her first action was to request a meeting with Naomi. The call came late in the afternoon. Patricia's voice was steady but unpretentious. "Ms. Carter, I'm aware of the events that led us here. I won't waste your time with excuses. I'd like to know exactly what changes you would need to see for Apex to regain your trust." Naomi appreciated the directness. "I'll send you the framework," she replied. "It's not just about representation. It's about transparency, pay, equity promotion, pathways, and cultural accountability. And it will be independently audited with results tied to executive compensation." Patricia didn't hesitate. Send it over. The ripples that began with a single moment in a conference room were now rewriting the terms of how an entire company and increasingly an entire sector would operate. And Naomi knew this was only the beginning. The lesson was spreading in a market that finally understood the cost of exclusion. The real power didn't belong to those who clung to outdated hierarchies. It belonged to those who could see what the future demanded and adapt before the tide became a wave. Months after Apex's leadership overhaul, the company had become a different place. Under Patricia Vega's steady hand, diversity audits were not just a public relations move, but a genuine mechanism for accountability. Pay scales were transparent, hiring panels were diverse, and promotion metrics were tied to measurable contributions rather than subjective fit. The atmosphere in the halls had shifted quieter confidence, replacing the cautious silence that once hung over every meeting. Naomi Carter observed from a deliberate distance. Carter Equity had chosen to reinvest in Apex, but on their terms. Every quarter, she received comprehensive cultural health reports alongside the standard financial statements. For Naomi, the numbers told two stories, one of recovering market performance and another of a workplace slowly healing from years of exclusion. She knew it wasn't perfect. No culture shift ever was, but the trajectory was undeniable. The industry had also changed. The Carter Standard, as the media called it, had been adopted by a growing coalition of investment firms. Companies seeking capital now anticipated cultural evaluations as rigorously as they prepared their financial projections. Some grumbled, calling it an unnecessary intrusion. Others embraced it, recognizing that inclusivity was no longer a soft metric, but a business imperative with quantifiable returns. Naomi didn't dwell on the headlines. Instead, she focused on building the next phase of her mission. The launch of the Founders Forward Fund, a $10 billion investment initiative for underrepresented entrepreneurs, was her boldest step yet. She knew the barriers they faced: lack of access to network systemic bias in funding decisions and the exhausting need to prove credibility again and again. This fund would bypass those roadblocks, entirely placing resources directly in the hands of innovators who had been overlooked. But with each victory came new resistance. At a private industry roundtable in Chicago, Naomi listened as a prominent hedge fund manager dismissed her approach as identity-based investing. He argued that the market didn't need social experiments, only performance. Naomi responded calmly, her voice steady over the clink of coffee cups. Performance isn't just numbers on a quarterly report. It's innovation, retention, adaptability, things you lose when you limit opportunity to a narrow profile of leadership. That's not a social experiment. That's basic economics. The room was silent for a moment before the discussion moved on. Behind the scenes, Naomi was preparing for a larger fight. She had learned that several powerful lobbying groups were pushing legislation that would weaken diversity and transparency requirements for public companies. If passed, it would undo years of incremental progress. This was not just a corporate battle, it was a political one. She convened her coalition partners, framing it as the next necessary front. We've proven change is possible in one company, then in one industry, she told them. Now, we have to protect it everywhere. Her resolve came from more than strategy, it was personal. She thought of her younger self, navigating rooms where she was underestimated before she even spoke. She thought of the talented women and men she had met who had quietly left industries they loved because the fight for basic respect was too exhausting. She thought of the engineer who wrote to her from Apex, "You made it matter to the people in power." The legacy she wanted wasn't just Apex's transformation. It was an unshakable precedent that discriminatory leadership carried a cost too high for any investor to ignore, and that capital could be a tool for equity rather than a weapon of exclusion. One crisp autumn morning, Naomi stood before a packed auditorium at the Global Leadership Summit in Boston. The audience was a mix of executives, investors, and young professionals, many of whom had followed the Apex story from its explosive beginning. She didn't tell the story the way the media had. There was no drama in her tone, no indulgence in the scandal. Instead, she spoke of the economic power of inclusion, the competitive advantage of diverse teams, and the responsibility of those who control capital to shape the market they profit from. She closed with a challenge, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had disarmed Apex's board months before. You may think the fight for equity in business is separate from the fight for performance. It's not. They are the same battle. The companies that will lead the next decade will be those that recognize talent in every form it comes in and have the courage to change the systems that keep it out. The standing ovation that followed was not just for her, but for the idea that the market could evolve, not because it was forced to, but because it chose to. And for Naomi Carter, that was the legacy worth building. Naomi Carter's story began quietly, almost unassumingly, but it would grow into a defining moment, not only for one company, but for an entire industry. She walked into Apex Dynamics that morning, appearing like just another visitor, calm, poised, and without the entourage that often followed people with her level of influence. What the executives in that room didn't realize was that they were standing at the edge of a turning point. They saw only her skin color, her gender, and the assumptions that came with both. They didn't see the $50 billion in assets she controlled, the years of experience she carried, or the fact that she was there to decide whether Apex's future would soar or collapse. What happened inside that building was a textbook case of embedded corporate prejudice. Subtle slights stacked on top of outright disrespect. Being left waiting. Being spoken to as if she couldn't possibly grasp basic concepts. Being reduced to a first name while her white male counterparts were addressed with titles. And then the insult that exposed their mindset, fully a refusal to shake her hand, paired with the demeaning label of staff. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She had come prepared to test not just the company's numbers, but its leadership character. What she saw confirmed exactly what her research had suggested, a toxic culture rooted in exclusion. The decision to pull the investment wasn't just about Apex. It was about sending a message to the entire business world. Through carefully calculated signals, Naomi set off a chain reaction that wiped millions off Apex's market value in hours. That was the language corporations understood, the direct, undeniable cost of discrimination. When the truth of her identity and influence came to light, panic gripped Apex's top floor. The CEO, who had once dismissed her presence, now scrambled for an apology, but it was too late. From that moment, Naomi shifted from investor to reformer. She didn't simply walk away. She laid out a roadmap for Apex to transform from pay transparency and blind recruitment processes to diversity-linked executive bonuses. It was uncompromising, specific, and tied directly to whether Apex would ever see her firm's money again. Under new leadership, the company took those steps. Slowly, at first then with momentum, the culture began to shift. Employees spoke up. Talent stopped leaving. And the stock once thought doomed began to climb again, proving the very point Naomi had come to make. But the ripples didn't stop at Apex's front door. Investors began adopting what the press dubbed the Carter Standard, requiring cultural health checks alongside financial due diligence. Some resisted. Others recognized the competitive advantage and moved quickly. The idea that diversity was a soft metric started to crumble. Numbers told a different story. Companies with inclusive leadership outperformed, innovated faster, and retained talent longer. Naomi's legacy is not a scandal, but a standard. She showed that leadership accountability is not a political statement, it's a business strategy. That prejudice, whether blatant or subtle, is not just morally wrong, but economically foolish. That those who control capital have the power, and therefore the responsibility, to decide which values they amplify in the marketplace. The lesson from her story is simple, but profound. Power is not inherently corrupting. It's defined by how you use it. Naomi could have walked away quietly, could have invested elsewhere, without confronting the injustice she saw. Instead, she chose to act in a way that forced change not just for herself, but for everyone who would come after her. In your own life, you might not be steering billions in investments, but you do hold influence in your workplace, your community, your relationships. The choice is whether to use it to reinforce the status quo or to open doors for others. This is also a reminder that discrimination doesn't always come in shouting or slurs. It often arrives in polite tones, in small exclusions, in lowered expectations. Recognizing those moments is the first step. Acting on them strategically, persistently, and with focus is how change becomes permanent. If you take anything from Naomi Carter's journey, let it be this: don't underestimate the impact of patience paired with precision. Not every battle is won in the moment. Some require you to wait, to watch, to collect your evidence and then strike in a way that leaves no doubt. And when you do, you might just find that the ripple you create reaches far beyond what you imagined. Her story is proof that the fight for equity and the pursuit of excellence are not separate. They are the same path. The companies, communities, and individuals who understand that will lead the future. If this story inspired you, if it made you think differently about leadership fairness or the power you hold, then take a moment to support the channel. Hit the like button so more people can hear stories like this, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Your engagement gives us the motivation to keep uncovering and sharing powerful narratives of justice, accountability, and transformation. The next story